What snakes do when you're not looking. There is a snake somewhere near you right now that already knows far more about your existence than you know about its. That may sound impossible. Most people imagine snakes as silent wanderers moving blindly through the world, creatures that slip through grass, disappear beneath leaves, and vanish into darkness without noticing much of anything around them. We tend to think of them as distant from our lives, disconnected from our routines, existing in a completely separate world. But researchers studying snake behavior have begun uncovering something surprising. Many snakes do not simply pass through an environment. They learn it, they remember it, and in ways that few people ever realize, they constantly gather information about the creatures sharing their space, including us. If you live near woods, fields, wetlands, or even a suburban backyard, there is a good chance that snakes have crossed your property many times without you ever seeing them. Yet every movement you make leaves behind traces, vibrations through the ground, changes in scent, alterations to the landscape, patterns of activity repeated day after day. To a snake, these patterns become part of a map. And what makes this remarkable is that the map is not static. It changes as you change. A snake may never see your face the way a crow does. It may never recognize you the way a dog recognizes its owner. Yet, scientists increasingly understand that snakes possess forms of environmental awareness that are far more sophisticated than people once believed. They notice, they compare, they adapt, and sometimes they make decisions based on what they have learned. Few people understand just how much of a snake's life unfolds beyond human observation. While you sleep, they travel routes they have memorized. While you work, they investigate familiar territories. While you sit inside your home, they may be quietly gathering information from the world just outside your walls. The strange truth is that some snakes know your routines better than you know theirs. That changes everything, because once you begin looking at their behavior differently, it becomes difficult to see them as simple creatures driven only by instinct. Instead, they begin to look like participants in an invisible world running alongside our own, a world filled with decisions, memories, caution, and surprisingly complex choices. And as this story unfolds, you will discover evidence that snakes may remember places longer than scientists once thought possible, learn from repeated experiences, and even alter their behavior based on the predictable habits of humans. But the most surprising discovery comes later, because one behavior researchers have observed reveals something unexpectedly familiar about the relationship between snakes and the environments they inhabit. And by the end of this video, you may find yourself seeing not only snakes differently, but also your own search for safety, belonging, and a place in the world. Most people assume that a snake moving through a landscape is simply reacting to whatever appears in front of it. A rustle in the grass, a warm rock, the scent of prey. The image is one of constant reaction, as though the snake is living entirely in the present moment. But that is not what researchers have found. There is something quietly extraordinary about the way snakes experience their surroundings. Imagine a snake emerging from a sheltered hiding place just after sunrise. The world around it appears unchanged to us. The same trees, the same fence, the same patch of earth. Yet, the snake immediately begins collecting information. It samples chemical traces drifting through the air. It senses subtle vibrations beneath the ground. It compares what is happening now with what has happened before. What makes this remarkable is that the snake is not merely looking for food. It is assessing change. Researchers studying reptile behavior have discovered that many snake species become highly familiar with their local environments. They learn where shelter is located. They learn which areas are safe. They learn where predators are most likely to appear. Over time, the landscape becomes less like a random collection of objects and more like a place with meaning. That may sound simple, but consider what it means. A place only becomes meaningful when an animal can distinguish between what belongs and what does not. When a new object suddenly appears in a familiar environment, snakes often investigate cautiously. When an old pathway becomes blocked, they adjust. When human activity changes in a certain area, they respond. They are noticing, not in the way humans notice, but in a way that serves the same purpose.
Few people understand that survival often begins with awareness long before action. Before any animal decides what to do, it must first determine whether something has changed. The snake's world depends on this ability, and perhaps ours does too. Every day, we move through familiar environments much like the snake does. We notice when a friend's voice sounds different. We notice when a room feels unfamiliar despite looking the same. We notice when something in our lives shifts even before we can explain why. Awareness is often the first step toward understanding. The snake reminds us of that. Because what you are watching is not a creature blindly following instinct. It is an animal continuously measuring its relationship with the world around it, deciding what belongs, what has changed, and what deserves attention. And that is where every meaningful connection begins.
If noticing is the first step, memory is what transforms information into experience. For decades, many people assumed that reptiles possessed only the simplest forms of memory. Compared to mammals and birds, they were often viewed as creatures living largely from moment to moment. Researchers have only recently discovered how incomplete that picture may be. In tracking studies, scientists have observed snakes returning to the same shelter sites, the same seasonal territories, and sometimes even the same overwintering locations year after year. Some travel surprisingly long distances, only to arrive at places they have not visited for months. That journey would be impossible without memory. Somewhere inside the snake's nervous system exists a record of previous experiences, a map built from countless encounters with terrain, temperature, shelter, and risk. Most people never realize how extraordinary this is. A snake hidden beneath a fallen log may appear motionless, disconnected from the larger world. Yet, its future decisions may depend on information gathered weeks, months, or even seasons earlier. Memory allows the snake to carry pieces of the past into the future. And perhaps that is true for all living things. Think about how much of your own life is guided by remembered places: a childhood home, a favorite road, a park bench where an important conversation happened. The location becomes meaningful because memory attaches itself to it. Without memory, places are only coordinates. With memory, they become part of who we are. What makes this remarkable is that even a creature as different from us as a snake appears to rely on the same fundamental principle. Experience matters. The past matters. Information gathered once can shape decisions far into the future. That changes how we see them, because what you are watching is not simply a reptile occupying a landscape. It is an animal carrying a history of that landscape within it, using yesterday's experiences to navigate today's uncertainties. And in that way, the snake is doing something deeply familiar. It is remembering where it belongs. Memory leads to something even more fascinating: recognition. Many people think recognition requires a face. We recognize friends by their expressions, family members by the sound of their voices. A familiar face in a crowd instantly separates itself from hundreds of strangers. Snakes experience the world differently. They live in a universe shaped far more by scent, vibration, temperature, and environmental patterns than by visual details alone. Yet recognition still plays a crucial role in their lives. Researchers studying reptile behavior have found evidence that snakes can distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar chemical signals. They can identify territories they have explored before. They can differentiate known shelters from unknown ones. Some species even show different responses to familiar individuals compared with strangers of their own kind. To us, these distinctions may seem small. To a snake, they can mean the difference between safety and danger. Imagine moving through a world where every scent carries a story, a trail left by prey, a predator that passed through hours earlier, a shelter that once provided protection during a storm. The landscape becomes a collection of remembered identities. What makes this remarkable is that recognition creates stability. The familiar requires less caution. The unfamiliar demands more. And suddenly, a snake's behavior begins to resemble something deeply human.
Most people never realize how much of their own emotional lives depend on recognition. We relax when we enter familiar places. We feel safer around people whose patterns we understand. We seek environments that remind us of where we belong. Recognition transforms uncertainty into comfort. That changes everything. Because the snake crossing a familiar territory is not merely moving through space. It is moving through a world filled with known signals, remembered locations, and trusted patterns. And perhaps that is why familiar places matter so much to all living creatures. Because recognition allows the world to feel less lonely. What you are watching is not instinct alone. It is an animal sorting the familiar from the unfamiliar, building a sense of stability within an unpredictable world. And that is something every one of us understands.
Once an animal can notice, remember, and recognize, something remarkable becomes possible: observation. Few people understand how much information animals gather simply by paying attention over time. A snake hidden beneath vegetation may appear inactive. It may remain motionless for hours, sometimes days. To an observer, it can seem as though nothing is happening. But stillness is not the same thing as absence. Researchers have observed snakes adjusting their activity patterns based on repeated environmental events. Some alter movement schedules to avoid predators. Others learn when prey species are most active. Many appear capable of adapting their routines according to recurring conditions in their surroundings. In other words, they are paying attention. Not through conscious reflection the way humans do, but through the accumulation of countless observations. Imagine a snake living near a hiking trail. Day after day, vibrations travel through the ground. Footsteps arrive at predictable times. Noise rises and falls according to familiar schedules. Gradually, patterns emerge. The snake does not need to understand human intentions. It only needs to recognize consistency. And consistency is information. Researchers have only recently begun appreciating how much animal behavior can be shaped by long-term observation of environmental regularities. The world is full of repeating signals, and successful animals learn to use them. What makes this remarkable is that observation allows prediction. The more accurately an animal can predict its surroundings, the better its chances of survival. Humans rely on the same principle every day. We observe the moods of people we care about. We notice habits. We detect routines. We learn what happens before certain outcomes occur. Eventually, we begin anticipating events before they happen. Observation becomes understanding, and understanding creates connection. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that a snake, a creature many people regard as mysterious and unknowable, is also engaged in this same fundamental process: watching, learning, adjusting. Not because it possesses human thoughts, but because survival rewards attention. What you are watching is an animal gathering pieces of a larger story, one observation at a time, until the world around it becomes more predictable than it first appeared. And perhaps wisdom, whether human or wild, begins exactly there, with the willingness to pay attention. Observation naturally leads to something even more powerful: learning. For much of modern history, reptiles were often described as creatures governed almost entirely by instinct. Their behaviors were assumed to be fixed, automatic, and largely resistant to experience. But that assumption has slowly begun to change. Researchers studying reptile cognition have found increasing evidence that snakes can modify behavior based on previous outcomes. Experiences matter, success matters, failure matters. A snake that repeatedly encounters danger in a certain location may begin avoiding it. A hunting strategy that works may be repeated. Routes that prove efficient may become preferred pathways. These changes may seem subtle, yet subtle learning can transform an animal's entire life. Most people never realize that learning is not about intelligence in the way we usually define it. It is about adaptation.
It is about allowing experience to influence future decisions. And that ability exists across far more species than we once imagined. Think about your own life. Many of the most important lessons you carry were never taught directly. They emerged through experience, through mistakes, through repeated encounters with the world, through noticing what worked and what did not. Over time, those experiences shaped who you became. The snake is engaged in a similar process, not with human emotions or human reasoning, but with the same fundamental principle. The future can be improved by learning from the past. That changes how we see intelligence itself, because intelligence is not always dramatic. Sometimes it appears in the quiet adjustment of behavior, in small corrections repeated over time, in an animal gradually becoming better suited to the world it inhabits. What you are watching is not a fixed creature endlessly repeating the same actions. It is an animal capable of being changed by experience, carrying lessons forward into tomorrow. And there is something deeply hopeful about that, because growth begins whenever experience becomes wisdom.
Learning eventually creates something that may seem surprising to associate with snakes: trust. Not trust in the human sense of friendship or affection, but trust as a behavioral decision. A wild snake survives by treating uncertainty as a potential threat. Caution is often the safest strategy. Every movement carries risk. Every unfamiliar encounter could be dangerous. And yet, researchers have observed something remarkable. When animals repeatedly experience the same harmless conditions, their responses often change. Behaviors that begin with extreme caution can gradually become less defensive. Energy once spent on constant vigilance can be redirected toward feeding, exploring, or resting. In essence, familiarity can reduce fear. Imagine a snake living near a quiet backyard. Day after day, a human waters plants, tends a garden, and leaves without disturbing the animal. Nothing dramatic happens, no direct interaction occurs, yet over time, the environment becomes predictable. The snake learns something important. Not that the human is a friend, but that the human is part of the landscape. Few people understand how significant that distinction is. The animal has incorporated a once uncertain element into its understanding of the world. That process resembles something deeply familiar to us. Many of our closest relationships begin the same way, not with immediate confidence, but with repeated evidence. Consistency replaces uncertainty. Predictability reduces fear. Trust grows not from promises, but from experience. What makes this remarkable is that trust, in its most basic form, is really a calculation about safety. The snake performs that calculation every day. So do we. Because what you are watching is an animal making a subtle but important decision. This part of the world has proven reliable enough to lower its guard. And every meaningful connection begins there. Most people think of communication as words, sounds, or visible gestures. Snakes use none of these in the ways we typically recognize. Yet, they communicate constantly. Researchers studying animal behavior have discovered that communication does not require language. It simply requires information being transmitted from one individual to another. For snakes, much of that information travels through chemical signals. A trail left on the ground can reveal identity, reproductive status, territory, and recent activity. Invisible messages linger long after the animal has disappeared from sight. To us, the forest may seem silent. To a snake, it is filled with information. What makes this remarkable is that communication often occurs without direct contact. One animal leaves evidence of its existence. Another interprets it. Decisions are made. Behaviors change. A conversation unfolds without either participant ever meeting. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. Because humans do something similar all the time. We leave traces of ourselves behind. A note, a photograph, a message, a memory in someone's mind. Long after we have left a place, pieces of our presence remain. Few people understand how much of life is built upon these invisible connections.
The world is full of signals exchanged between individuals who may never fully realize the impact they have on one another. That changes everything. Because the snake moving through its environment is not isolated from the larger community around it. It is participating in a network of information, responding to messages written into the landscape itself. What you are watching is not silence. It is communication occurring in a language most humans never notice. And perhaps connection is far more common than we realize.
And this brings us to the most surprising realization of all, the ability to choose. For many years, people viewed snakes as creatures governed almost entirely by instinct, responding automatically to whatever circumstances confronted them. But the deeper scientists look, the more complicated the picture becomes. A snake may choose one shelter over another, one hunting location over another, one route through its territory instead of several alternatives. Those choices are influenced by memory, experience, recognition, observation, and learning. Everything we have discussed leads here, to decision-making. Not human decision-making, not conscious reflection as we understand it, but choices nonetheless. Researchers have only recently discovered how flexible animal behavior can be when experience accumulates over time. The result is not a creature trapped by instinct, but one continuously adjusting its actions to fit an ever-changing world. And suddenly, the snake becomes far more relatable than most people expect, because all of us are shaped by the same process. We notice, we remember, we recognize, we observe, we learn, we trust, we communicate, and eventually we choose. There is something profoundly moving about that. A snake hidden beneath leaves on the edge of a forest may seem completely disconnected from human experience, yet beneath the surface, it is navigating many of the same fundamental challenges faced by every living thing. How do I stay safe? Where do I belong? What should I remember? What can I trust? What path should I take next? Most people never realize that these questions echo throughout the natural world, not because animals think exactly as we do, but because life itself requires answers to them. And perhaps that is the final revelation. When you see a snake, it is easy to focus on how different it is from us. The scales, the movement, the silence, the mystery. But beneath those differences is an animal trying to build a workable relationship with its world, just as we are. Searching for safety, responding to experience, carrying memories forward, making choices based on what it has learned. In that sense, the distance between our lives may not be as great as it first appears, because belonging is not uniquely human. The desire for familiarity is not uniquely human. The importance of memory is not uniquely human. Across forests, deserts, grasslands, wetlands, and backyards, countless animals are engaged in the same quiet process of finding their place in a complicated world. And perhaps that recognition changes the way we see them. Perhaps it also changes the way we see ourselves. So the next time you pass through a garden, walk along a trail, or glance toward a patch of tall grass, remember that there may be a snake nearby experiencing that world in ways most people never imagine. Not simply reacting, not merely surviving, but noticing, remembering, learning, and choosing. And maybe that realization makes the natural world feel a little less distant. I'd love to hear your story. Has there ever been a wild animal that seemed to recognize a place, a routine, or even your presence in a way that surprised you? Share your experience in the comments. Some of the most meaningful encounters happen when we realize we are not the only ones paying attention. And until next time, thank you for watching, and thank you for looking a little more closely at the quiet lives unfolding all around us.